Another objection raised by skeptics. It's amazing how quickly they make accusations and how poor their support is for their accusation. We have to do all the homework. But then God says we're supposed to study and show ourselves approved. So Mary should be disqualified to transfer the rights of her lineage to her son, Jesus, since she is a woman. Phil Luna states in his article, Mary should be disqualified to transfer the rights of her lineage to her son, except for a little-known exception to the rule. What's the rule? In Matthew 1:1-16 and Luke 3:23-38, we are presented with two genealogies of Jesus Christ. On the surface, these different listings would appear to be a contradiction in the Scriptures. The genealogy found in Matthew's Gospel is the lineage of Jesus' earthly father Joseph, while the genealogy found in Luke's Gospel is the lineage of Jesus' mother Mary. However, many of the people that teach on the genealogies fail to realize or address a major problem associated with the genealogical listing found in Luke's Gospel, the lineage of Mary. Once you have established that the line is indeed Mary's, you must deal with the second difficulty. The rights of the line are not passed through the mother, only the father. Even though Mary, through her lineage, was of the Davidic bloodline, she should be excluded from being able to pass those rights of the bloodline because of being a female. Deuteronomy 1:16. So, it is not enough to prove that Mary was an unblemished descendant of David. She had to be a male to transfer the rights. Therefore, she would be disqualified to transfer the rights of her son Jesus, except for a little-known exception to the rule. Numbers 26, we are introduced to Zelophehad, okay. We are told had no sons, only daughters. Numbers 27, following the death of Zelophehad, the daughters of Zelophehad came before Moses and argued their plight. Because their father had died with no sons, all of their rights of inheritance were to be lost, and they felt that this was unfair. So Moses prayed to God, and God gave Moses an exception to the rule. The Lord told Moses that the inheritance can flow through a female if they fulfill two requirements. There must be no male offspring in the family, Numbers 27:8, and if the female offspring should marry, they must marry within their own tribe. Now we come back to Mary. On the surface, she should be unable to transfer the rights to her son. But when you research, you find that Mary had no brothers, and Mary did indeed marry within her own tribe to Joseph. What an awesome God we serve that set in order the requirements to allow the virgin birth to take place 1,400 years in advance. Did Mary have any brothers? By Gary Kramer, after reading the detailed information above, I asked Phil if he knew of any information on Mary's brothers. He cited numerous non-canonical works, such as the Catholic Encyclopedia, the apocryphal book called Proto-Evangelium of James. Tradition states that Mary had no brothers. Curious, I went through the four Gospels looking for any reference to corroborate Phil's references. In John 19:25-27 we read, Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his home. We see from this passage that Mary had a sister. Jesus is not saying to his mother, look at me on the cross with the statement, Woman, behold your son. Jesus is telling his mother that John, the only disciple to the cross, is going to care for her. Jesus also tells John that he must care for Mary. We must acknowledge that Joseph, Jesus' father, has probably died, since we see no references to Joseph after Jesus was 12 years old in Luke 2:41-52. To understand why Jesus is telling John to care for Mary, we must understand the Jewish culture at that time. When a woman with children was widowed, she would move back with her father or brother. If her father had also died, and there were no brothers, then one of her sons might care for her. Get my shoe here. In this case, Jesus was the eldest son of Mary and was probably supporting her at this time. He passes the responsibility to John, one of his disciples and not a son of Mary. From the comments of Jesus, we can extrapolate that Jesus was caring for Mary, which means that Mary had no brothers, at least none that were alive at this time. Taken with the extra-biblical literature that Mary had no brothers, we can assume that she passed the first prerequisite that God had given as law, Numbers 27:8. So you skeptics haven't done your homework. Now we see the reason for two different genealogies in Matthew 1 and Luke 3. Not only do we see Joseph's line in Matthew 1, but also Mary's line in Luke 3. Both the genealogies show that both Mary and Joseph came from the same tribe of Judah, fulfilling the second requirement by law, Numbers 36:6. So, the reason for God placing two genealogies is to show that Jesus, being of virgin birth, came from Mary's line, which was not cursed as was Joseph's. Also to show that both Mary and Joseph came from the same line, which is a legal necessity if Jesus was to claim Mary's line and not Joseph's cursed line. We find that on the surface, the Bible can be simple enough to understand, but the complexity we are discovering in which it was written is astonishing. Phil Luna is an ordained Assemblies of God minister. He teaches a weekly Bible study, verse by verse, through the Bible. His favorite area of study is the Hebraic roots of Christianity. Matthew's lineage does not have every name in it it's supposed to have, and is therefore suspect. I've communicated this with Dr. M.M. Ninan. We had a good relationship with I can ask him these questions and he would give me detailed answers. Matthew's lineage is certainly not all-inclusive. We know for certain that he omitted 6 names from the list of actual rulers who sat on the throne of David. These names were known to every historian and the scribe when Matthew wrote his gospel, and he certainly knew it. So he omits certain people for reasons of legitimacy, curse, unacceptable behavior, and so on. The same is acceptable throughout the line. If he missed 6 names during the period of monarchy, we do not know how many were missed after the captivity for similar and legitimate reasons. Since we do not have the records, we do not also know why. Jews would have been the first to point out such blatant errors and laughed at the history of it at its inception. We get no such reaction, though. The life of the captives in dispersion were so mixed up they certainly must have resorted to Levirate marriage. There was no need of a grandfather to adopt, officially a grandson to be made a legal heir. Then this was considered a cultural norm. If an older son died, the younger son became heir without any formality. All these factors are to be taken into account, especially during the turbulent dispersion era. It's very amazing how God gives people, the skeptics, the unbelievers, an opportunity to raise objection, but then they don't fulfill their legitimate requirement to prove it. We have to prove it. And God's direction there is we believers are to study and show ourselves approved and be ready with an answer. How about that? Let me give some example. Nina gives an example. A is the patriarch. He begets B while A was 25 years old. B begets C while he was 25 years old. B died or was taken prisoner or sold in slavery when he was 30. Then C is the heir to A. But he becomes the sole holder of the title of the family only when A dies. If A died at the age of 90, C comes to his heritage only at the age of 40. Suppose C died while he was 30 and had a son by 20 called D. The heir to A is now D, and we will have missed B and C from the legal line. For Matthew, A, first, to D, second, is just 2 generations till D's death. The alienation need not be death. It can be socially unacceptable behavior. It can be simply a disappearance or a conviction of crime or marrying outside of the community. A recent example of this was King Edward's abdication of the throne of England. In the context of Matthew's presentation, this is to be expected. So the names were omitted as a result of God's judgment. The fact that 14 names came up in each period of time does not prove out a contrived genealogy unless other names were actually left out for illegitimate reasons, creating an error of omission. This is not the case, as this study has shown. There is therefore proved no error of omission. It is evident that the decrees of the sovereignty of God are testified to in this number 14 rather than the contrivance of Matthew. Remember, others have set precedents for this. So, to raise up an argument without substantiation or evidence is nonsensical. Yet, we should endeavor to study ourselves, to show ourselves approved, and provide a ready-made answer. Remember how James did it. Made up an imaginary objector. But someone will say, you have your faith here, I have my deeds there, the two aren't connected. And then James goes on, you foolish fellow, don't you realize Abraham was declared the friend of God? He was declared righteous by faith alone, and declared to be the friend of God with what he did in his faithful life toward the end, especially with his son Isaac. So here, objectors in point E maintain that the purpose of the genealogies in Matthew, Luke, and elsewhere is not to give an accurate history, which they maintain are not biological but are falsely contrived to make one theological point or another. So, an unbiased reading of the biblical genealogies within the context will indicate that they simply attempt to establish our Lord's actual and real biological lineage, which was prophesied in Scripture so as to qualify him for consideration as the true Messiah that was foretold. And we have only one human being on the planet throughout history that's qualified, that's Jesus Christ himself. So if the genealogies are purposed not to give accurate history, then they are not genealogies at all, but nothing but nonsense. So we have John Nolan in his commentary. Ancient genealogies were used for a complex variety of purposes. Genealogies established individual identity, reflected, established, or legitimate social structures. Legitimated, I guess, you'd say social structures. Legitimized, I would say. Status and entitlements to office function as modes of praise or delineations of character, or even as a basis for exhortation. Careful observance of Matthew's genealogy will discover that it is not all-inclusive, nor intended to be. Matthew could not be claiming that it was all-inclusive in view of the fact that the omissions are too obvious for the contemporary Jewish community to miss. Back early on, we find no objections that are legitimized for why he did these genealogies, lists. Furthermore, in consideration of the great attention over the millennia the Jews have paid toward their genealogical history relative to the preservation of their race and the identification of the Messiah, if any genealogy in the Bible was suspect of not being truly biological, the Bible would not have survived all these years intact and as originally written. We can go back to early history, first century. Where are the objections? No legitimate ones. And where are the ones later? None of them are legitimate. The further away in history you go, we get more nonsense. The genealogies of Scripture stand out as highly specific and biological, and thus authenticatable at the time each was written. And you saw the chart, how the Old Testament supports so many of the names in the genealogies of Matthew and Luke. Yet there has not been forthcoming over hundreds of years any trustworthy alternative evidence totally refuting any name listed in any genealogy in Scripture. Isn't that interesting? We have other civilizations, and they have their own particular political genealogies and lists and so on, and some of them are very suspect, no evidence whatsoever, and some of them seem legitimate. But in the Bible, every name is legitimized. No evidence against